Right, everybody. I do not have push to talk on this. Welcome. If you hear a small child yelling in the background, that's my son. So, let us get started. I'll start talking once I see this pop on the screen. Great. Okay. So welcome everybody. Today we're continuing. If you're new and you've never seen this before, hi. This is my detail. This is who I am. So today we're doing Mills on Liberty. So John Stuart Mill's on Liberty. We're going to continue. We only did chapter 1, I'm pretty sure. Let's see. Yep, maybe 1 and a little bit of 2. So we're going to jump in here, keep going with Mill. All right. So, and we'll get to application if we can, and if you're in the class, which is probably everybody, right, we're still going to do journals. We'll start journaling probably next week. I was going to say today, but I'm feeling nice. So from Tuesday, we'll have another journal. And this time, obviously, you can't write it by hand, right? You have to write it online and just send it to me. So the file will be just fine. All right, and open that. Great. Oh, and thanks for linking the stream, Russell. Appreciate it. Okay. So let's go. We did intro last time, so I'm just going to blast through this for anybody who missed it. You can now go back through and see it. So this was the intro. Ooh. And I'm pretty sure, somebody let me know, I'm pretty sure we actually did chapter 2 in class. It's been a week and somebody's typing. I'm 99% sure we did finish chapter 2, in fact. So I don't want to spend too much time on this. If we did it, hopefully we can get through Mill by next Tuesday. That'll be the goal. So basically Mill is defending liberty. That's the whole point of this book, hence the title, right? So he's defending why we have liberty. What's the point? Why should we care? And somebody says we did. Great. So we did chapter 2. So if you've never read Mill, it's a 150-year-old book. You should have it. If you're one of my students, you should definitely have it. So all right, here we go. So we're going to start chapter 3. And this one is called, let me get my bookmark too. So chapter 2 was of the liberty of thought and discussion. So this idea that to kind of approach truth, to give you a little recapitulation, to approach any kind of truth in reality, you need to actually have discussion, or you just can't know it straight up. It's impossible. Or you'll have such an incomplete truth. Okay. So yeah, if you're having trouble with the stream, make sure it's unmuted. Make sure to refresh it. A couple people might be having problems. So I'm assuming from the feedback most people can hear me. So, and if you're having trouble with the sound, you could restart everything, and then it'll still be there later for you to rewatch it. Okay, so let's get into chapter 3. Here we go. So Mill 3. This is where we start to get interesting. Okay. So Mill 3 is of individuality as one of the elements of well-being. That's the name of the chapter. And his basic claim in this chapter, and by the way, I'll take all the questions. If you have questions, feel free to type them. And at the end of each slide, I'll pause for questions. Oh, that's great. One of the students had sound problems. I'll pause for about 30 seconds to 2 minutes at the end of each slide to give you guys a chance to ask me questions. So that'll be your chance. Now, as I go too, you can just type questions and I can answer them at the end if I don't notice them. So stream of consciousness, it's not interrupting. Okay, so the first one, the claim he's making here, right? The claim, should men be free to act as they like without harming others at their own risk and peril? And it's not a question, it's actually a statement, right? Men should be free. But this is kind of the basic question, right? What are the definitions? Why are we allowed to do this? And let me find this quote here. He says, let us next examine whether, and this is on 57, whether the same reasons do not require that men should be free to act upon their opinions, to carry out in their lives without hindrance, either physical or moral, from their fellow man, so long as it is their own risk or peril. This last proviso is, of course, indispensable. No one pretends that actions should be free as opinions. So this one is both reminiscent of our current times, but it's also good to remind you that there's that limiter there, right? So you have action freedom as an individual for your own well-being as long as I don't have to, as long as you pay for your consequences. Now, the reason this is intellectually interesting, right? Because we live in a time when there is a lot of socialized, we'll say socialized consequences. So because of that, do we even really have Mill's freedom, and can we even talk about it that way? That's kind of the great point of Mill. So once other people start paying for your consequences, Mill would say you probably can't be free, as one would say. Now, leading straight into this, let's see if there's anything else I want to say. No, I did the risk and peril good. So here too, we get to this is interesting. On 60, we get to the defense and limits of traditionalism. Now, talking about Mill being a kind of, how would we say it? He's definitely liberal, right? That's the name of his book. He's one of the first, liberals to call himself that, would be what I would say. But we also get to when is tradition any good, right? Because when we think liberal in the 21st century sense, you might think anti-tradition. But Mill is very specific about this. He says the traditions and customs of other people are, to a certain extent, evidence of what their experience has taught them. This is on 60, by the way, if you have your book. Presumptive evidence, and as such, have a claim to his defense, but, in the first place, their experience may be too narrow, or maybe didn't interpret it rightly. Second, their interpretation of experience may be correct, but is unsuitable to him, that is one person. And then finally, customs are made for customary circumstances and customary characters, and his circumstances or character may be uncustomary. And then thirdly, although the customs are both good as customs and suitable to him, to conform to custom merely as custom does not educate or develop him in any qualities that are distinctive endowment of the human being. And then he goes on here to the problem with custom can be, of course, if you don't make choices. But this doesn't actually limit custom for Mill. Why not? Well, it's good to remember first, like I said, I did the quote, right? But what experience has taught people, it may not be relevant to you specifically, but it's good to remember that all tradition is basically social memory, right? So it's do you need to make all the same mistakes yourselves? Don't get me wrong, people would say, yes, of course I have to, but if humans did that every time, we would never get anywhere. So tradition is this kind of building up of correct or, things that actually work. Now, what is his line? Where does he write this line where he says, okay, now this is the barrier of tradition? Well, so for him, he thinks it's necessity of critical reason faculties. Otherwise, we're just apes. So the way to understand, and by ape he both means the animal and the verb, right? When you to ape something, you just copy it or parrot it, right? So you don't want to just ape an action because it's custom. For him, he thinks you need to understand in your critical reason why the custom works. And then once you understand it, you should do it. And this is a big thing for Mill, right? He's a very reason-focused guy. And probably a good critique of Mill is he's too much a reason-focused guy. This is where he'll get his biggest hits, just in history, right? It's because, let's be honest, humans are not always reasonable, just straight up. All right, now, this is an interesting, he actually used a little bit of artistic imagery, so I didn't want to skip this. So he compares humans, and if you want to know more about tradition, by the way, 60 and 61 have a lot more, but on 63, or 60, let's see, yeah, on 62 he has some examples of human social tyranny. Where was this? Oh, here we go, yeah. So this is 60 to 61. He says, who lets the world or his own portion of it choose his plan of life for him has no need of any other faculty than the ape-like one of imitation. He who chooses his plan for himself employs all his faculties. He must use observation to see, reasoning and judgment to foresee, activity to gather materials for decision, discrimination to decide, and when he has decided, firmness and self-control to hold his deliberate decision. So this is where we get that very modern focus on deliberative decision-making. If you remember our paper, right, where we did will versus determinism, this is strictly speaking a will argument, right? So you're saying you have the self-control to focus, you have the will to do it, right? And then you have to execute it. So then he says here, it might be possible that he might be guided in some good path, kept out of harm's way without any of these things. But what will be his comparative worth as a human being? Is it really as importance? Not only what men do, but also what manner of men they are that do it. Among the works of man, which human life is rightly employed in perfecting and beautifying, the first importance surely is man himself. Supposing it were possible to get houses built, corn grown, battles fought, causes tried, and even churches erected and prayed, by machinery, by automatons in human form, it would be a considerable loss to exchange for these automatons even the men and women who at present inhabit more civilized parts of the world, and who assuredly are but starved specimens of what nature can and will produce. Human nature is not a machine to be built after a model and set to do exactly work prescribed to it, but a tree which requires to grow and develop itself on all sides, according to the tendency of the inward forces that make it a living thing. And this is where I get this tree quote, right? So humans aren't actually machines, and from Mill, right, if you look at humans as purely machinery, and again, we're in the 21st century, there is this push to kind of look at us like that. But we're not machinery, right? So there's this idea that humans, to do true flourishing, right, we have to look at humans much more like trees, where we have to grow them. We don't cultivate, and go back to Confucius if you're in my traditional Asia class, right? This idea that you have to do cultivation on these trees, not just machinery and programming. All right, now this is interesting too. Immediately, he then makes an argument for what he calls the examples of, where's this? Energy. I'm trying to find my quotes here. Oh yeah, this is 61 to 62. He talks about basically human impulses of humans. So he says, this is on the bottom of 61 if you have it. To a certain extent, it is admired that our understanding should be our own, but there is not the same willingness to admit that our desires and impulses should likewise, or that to possess impulses of our own, or of any strength, is anything but a peril and a snare. Yet desires and impulses are such, as a part of a perfect human being, as belief and restraint, and a strong impulse are only perilous when not properly balanced, when a set of aims and inclinations is developed into strength, while others, which ought to coexist with them, remain weak and inactive. It is not because men's desires are strong that they act ill. It is because their conscience is weak. There is no natural connection between strong impulses and a weak conscience. The natural connection is the other way. To say one person's desires and feelings are stronger and more various than those of another is merely to say he has more of the raw material of human nature, and is therefore capable perhaps of more evil, but certainly more good. So again, here we get this defense of human exuberance, basically, right? So like strong impulses and these passions are actually a benefit to society, right? Because a lot of culture, and even today, right, we see it, I mean, come on, you're university students, everybody. Literally the design of education is to kind of keep you down, raise your hand, be very, how would I say it? Be quite, to stay calm and staid and not over impulse. Mill would have nothing of this. He says strong impulses are but another name for energy. Energy may be turned to bad uses, but more good can always be made of an energetic nature than of an indolent and impassive one. Those who are the most natural feeling are always those who cultivate feelings may be made the strongest. The same strong susceptibilities which make the personal impulses vivid and powerful are also the source from whence are generated the most passionate love of virtue and the sternest self-control. It is through the cultivation of these that society both does its duty and protects its interests, not by rejecting the stuff which these heroes are made, because it knows not how to make them. A person who desires and impulses are his own, and the expression of his own nature, as it has been developed and modified by his own culture, is said to have a character. And then he goes on to say, whoever thinks individuality of desires and impulses should be not encouraged to unfold itself, must maintain that society has no need of strong natures. It is not better for containing many persons who have such a character, and that high general average of energy is not desirable. So the question he asks is like, what are we missing out if we basically cookie cutter people too much? We force people to act like low energy people. It's an interesting thing to think about. And again, this is Mill, again, a liberal, right? Sorry about that. He's distinctly focused on personal character. He's focused on people and what they're doing and what their energy is, right? This is basically his MO. So he's really trying to defend that, like, freedom is unleashing these human energies, right? And again, without harming others and at their own risk. So those two things are key, right? So this is where we get this foundation for these ideas. All right. So continue to go. So he points this down. Wearing people down into uniformity does not an individual make. Basically, this is his follow-up point, right? If human energy is such a good thing, and if the goal of a good society is to keep an individual from destroying it, but also it's this idea that if we wear down people into pure uniformity, we don't have individuals, and then we undermine this energy, right? Not only just the well-being of people, but we undermine the energy of people, and this is a big deal for Mill. He really does not find this to be the best course for humanity. All right, what else are we doing here? Okay, now this is interesting too. He then starts to decry what he calls the despotism of man and religion. So here he gets into things he doesn't like, and if you're a Calvinist, cover your ears. He really doesn't like Calvinists. Now, why doesn't he like Calvinists? Well, if you read, this is from 63 to 65. Calvinists get blamed for a lot of things in general. Strictly speaking, right, he basically misrepresents them a bit. So here we go. So the one great offense of man is self-will, all good of which humanity is capable of compromise and obedience. You have no choice, thus you must do and not otherwise. Whatever is not duty is a sin. Human nature being radically corrupt, there is no redemption in any way until human nature is killed within him. So he takes the 5-point Calvinist thing and then makes it extreme. Now, if you don't know what a Calvinist is, they're a kind of Protestant Christian who, when misrepresented, basically don't believe in free will. That's not strictly it, but it's more like God picks who's saved, and that can be inferred that humans don't have will. Now, I think probably if you read Calvin, and I'm a nerd, so I've read Calvin, Calvin just thinks that if we can pick, God can pick. So it turns into something called predestination, where basically God picks twice. But for someone like Mill, right, Mill is a liberal, he sees that as despotic, right? If people are just in or out, that is a type of despotism, and he is not a fan. The same thing can happen with man, right? Despotism of man, let's see, and here we go. So the problem is when the despotism of man, his only really complaint about this, he says, even if despotism does not produce its worst effects, so long as an individual exists under it, and whatever crushes individuality is despotism, and whatever name it be called, and by whatever it professes to be enforcing the will of God or the injunction of man. That's on 65. So he's actually not even really on the individual level. He's not strictly speaking against political despotism if there was individual freedom. Now, as we've kind of seen in, what would I say, we've seen in modern times, that's not always the case, right? You tend to have more political despotism that correlates, but not is caused by individual, keeping the individual down. But Mill thought if you could have like a despotic government and individual freedom, that's not a bad compromise in his kind of mindset, anyway. All right. Now, this is where he makes his kind of I will call it the magnum opus of the chapter, but his major point here, which is, let's see, read my notes. Oh yeah, so basically to harness individuals and geniuses and eccentrics, and this is on 66 if you have your book, where we need an atmosphere of freedom, and his quote here, let me find it. Genius can only breathe in an atmosphere of freedom. Persons of genius are, ex vi termini, more individual than other people, less capable consequently of fitting themselves without hurtful compression into any of the small number of molds which society provides in order to save its members the trouble of forming their own character. If from timidity they consent to be forced into one of these molds, let all the parts themselves which cannot expand under the pressure remain unexpanded. Society will be little better for their genius. If they are strong character and break free of their fetters, they become a mark for the society which does not succeed in reducing them to a commonplace, to a point with solemn warning as wild or erratic, and such the like, much as if one should complain of Niagara River not flowing smoothly between its banks like a Dutch canal. So he points out that we need these eccentric geniuses, and without individuality, right? We don't have eccentricities and geniuses and people doing these amazing things. So this is kind of his defense. Like, why should we be free? And if you remember, we talked a little bit about it, and we'll come back to it next week, that Mill's utilitarian. You're basically, his argument for freedom individual freedom comes into this, right? You're losing all of this talent, basically, right? You're losing these eccentrics, these geniuses, these people that create and build, if you kind of cut out from under them this thing. And then This is a great quote of his. It'll take a second to come up, but originality is the one thing which unoriginal minds cannot feel the use of. And this is, again, why freedom for Mill and a lot of liberals is principle. Is you can't really explain straight up to an unoriginal mind what the purpose is of originality. So it's better to just let it happen, and then we can all reap those benefits, right? That's kind of the liberal argument for that. But if we not in Mill, even though he's a reasoned guy, he kind of makes a point here that we can't. Originality itself isn't a thing we can actually explain to everybody. So sometimes we have to trust that, like, okay, more freedom has more utility to all of us. So he'd rather have you just understand utility. That's kind of his dream. So it's an interesting, we'll say, trouble. All right, now we're at the end of the first slide. We're not at the end of chapter 2, but now I will take questions. If you have questions, please type them into the Twitch. You can type them into the Twitch stream, or you can save them, or you can type. For today, we'll just do typed. You can type them in the 492 chat, and I'll be happy to answer them as best as I'm able. I have my notes here anyway. Oh, man. And let's see, okay. Okay, we got a question here. I'll read it and then try to answer it. So, good human energy comes from those who embrace those impulses with restraint. So, freedom in part allowing people to either do good or bad, not conditioning per se. Well, Mill still kind of has the idea that. So, Mill's definition of bad, because he's utilitarian, comes down to a couple things. First, lack of freedom is bad because we basically get less benefit from these geniuses, from the ability to make your own choices. Also, a bad for Mill would be so lack of freedom and then lack of the benefits, right? So utility is like the most human flourishing, and he says as one of the elements of well-being for the title of the chapter, right? So this idea that the well-being part of well-being is freedom. So his argument for freedom, and freedom being good, by the way, he doesn't strictly say it, but good and true for Mill and most liberals means some combination of human flourishing, human freedom, because freedom leads to flourishing and stuff and just being profitable and, making it fully. So that's kind of the idea of what the point of human energy is. So freedom is a good because it leads to the best good, which is like human flourishing. That's basically a Millian utilitarian radical argument. And when I say radical, I mean capital R radical. But that's a good question. Let's see, is there any Twitch questions? No Twitch questions. All right, any other questions before we jump on into the second part of chapter 3? If you do, we got to follow up. We'll give it a second to type. Yeah, and a student asked the great question. So for Mill, despotism is fine if the individual is preserved. Political despotism is fine if there's individual freedom. And I would argue here, if chapter 1 we kind of blew over it, but Mill gets a little bit into the political side of this, which is, for him, individual freedom and flourishing will eventually just kind of lead to a better despotism anyway. If you think about, because we're in Asian studies, right? It's good to think about this. Think about, like, the argument for China for the last 30 years has basically been, even if their government's a little despotic, if they have individual liberties, and those are preserved, they'll both get the flourishing from those freedoms, both economically but, interpersonally. And in addition, they'll also get they might even liberalize eventually. Now, the second part, this is a fun part with theory, right? Theory doesn't always work. That second part didn't work out very well. But the first part did happen, right? China did flourish because they generally were less despotic on an individual level. They still have controls, it's still East Asia, right? But they had more of that human flourishing because they let people kind of do their thing. So yeah, that's a good question. Okay, I'm going to keep going. If you have more questions, great. Keep typing. All right. So now we're going to get into Mill chapter, second half of the chapter. So this is where Mill can get kind of where you can see the people who maybe don't like him. Here we go. So Mill then gets into what does mass mean. Now when I say mass, we mean like mass communication, mass culture, things like that, right? So when Mill says mass, he doesn't mean it in a good way. For him, mass just means mediocrity. And let me see this here. Where's the quote? It does seem, and this is on 69 if you have the book, it does seem, however, that when the opinions of masses are merely average men are everywhere becoming or becoming dominant power, the counterpose or corrective to that tendency would be more and more pronounced individuality of those who stand on the higher eminences of thought. In these circumstances, most specifically, that exceptional individuals, instead of being deterred, would be encouraged, acting differently than the mass. In other times, there was no advantage to doing so unless they acted not only differently, but better. In this age, the mere examples of nonconformity, of a refusal to bend the knee to custom, is itself a service, precisely because the tyranny of opinion is such. To make eccentricity a reproach, it is desirable, in order to break through that tyranny, that people should be eccentric. Eccentricity has always abounded where strength of character has abounded. The amount of eccentricity in a society has generally been proportional to the amount of genius, mental vigor, and moral courage which it contained. That so few now dare to be eccentric marks the chief danger of our time. So remember, when we're saying eccentricity, we're not saying law-breaking necessarily. We're not saying immorality or things that are hurting humans. That's a big thing for liberals, right? You can't hurt other people. You have to pay for the cost of your actions. But generally speaking, we should let people be eccentric as long as they're not hurting people. That's kind of the liberal argument. But the mass itself is collective mediocrity, right? Because how do we be better than the average? It's a great question. Well, you'd have to raise up the average. And then he points out here, too, there's basically a trouble in the transition between these two things. Let me see. This is on my next page. I think it's on the bottom. Let me see where I put this. Oh, here we go, yeah. Nope, I don't have it. Why not? Okay, the transition between nobility and... Man, I cannot write where I found this from. Why did I care so much about that? I'm skipping to the next one. Let's see. Oh, here we go, yeah. So, this is interesting. So, he talks about the transition between nobility and democracy. Okay, brain fart, it's back. This is the big gap, right? Because in nobility, you basically have no collective mediocrity because it doesn't get a vote. Does that make sense? Mill and a lot of liberals get kind of stuck on this if they're logically consistent, which is basically the point that you actually have a lot of human flourishing and greatness in a noble society because nobles have no problem with hierarchy and promoting exceptional individuals, right? They'll just pay them or something or promote them. So it doesn't hurt their social order to have exceptional individuals. But in a democracy, it tends to harm the social order if those kind of individuals are overemphasized. That leads to this next point, where he makes a point of diversity of taste is enough reason not to force conformity, and that's before you get to freedom of belief. So, now for diversity for him, let me read this. Now this is interesting. So humans should be free to choose the way they live, not imposed by from a minority or majority. Diversity is diversity of thought, which is belief. Custom, action within bounds. So this is the key here, right? The bounds have to be, right, you can't harm other people, you can't impinge on other people's beliefs or rights, but you also have to be part of the society you're in. We'll get to that. That's the next chapter, actually. And the diversity of taste is most free in his opinion. Let me give you a quote from here. And then this leads to some issues, like he does talk about, for example, the problem of mental health, right? So can mentally ill people make choices? Obviously not. Can children? Mill is a big no, right? Children don't get that freedom. So those kind of things are interesting to point out. Oh, he does always mention, though, the problem is humans, especially in democracies, have this, what he calls a crush towards the mediocre. So it's good to try to avoid that. Now, why do you want freedom of belief? He ties it straight back to his previous chapter. Same reason you want freedom of speech is because the freedom to believe what you will, again, if you have the full consequences of your beliefs. This is kind of the foundational principle for a liberal society to survive, because if you're compelled to believe something you don't really believe it, that's not freedom, you lose those benefits. All right. Now this is very interesting, and again, I would say this is the line between what we'd now call progressive, and 150 years ago, by the way, they had progressives too, progressives and liberals. Not all improvements improve liberty. Not all progress improves liberty. This one can be very edgy, but again, Mill kind of saw this coming. Let me give you a quote here. Let's see. Here we go. The despotism of custom is everywhere. This is 72 if you have your book. The despotism of custom is everywhere the starting hindrance to human advancement, being unceasing antagonism to what disposition to aim at something better than customary, which is called, according to circumstances, the spirit of liberty, or that the spirit of progress or improvement. The spirit of improvement is not always the spirit of liberty, for it may aim at forcing improvements on an unwilling people, and the spirit of liberty, insofar as it resists such attempts, may ally itself locally or temporally with opponents of improvement. But the only unfailing and permanent source of improvement is liberty, since by it there are as many possible independent centers of improvement there as there are individuals. The progressive principle, however, in either shape, whether as a love of liberty or improvement, is antagonistic to the sway of custom, involving at least emancipation from the yoke, and the contest between the two constituents of chief interest of the history of mankind. Basically, history. Do I have it on here? Oh, I don't. So, basically, history is a fight between custom and progress. And for him, he didn't think liberals should take a side, right? Whatever makes people free, again, within the bounds we've already talked about, is the one that people should, whichever in prance is liberty, not freedom, right? So liberty being defined as freedom plus responsibility and duty. As long as liberty is advanced, a liberal should go there. So sometimes you're with the custom, sometimes you're with progress. All right. Now, we talked about tyranny of opinion before, and I'll just point out here, and this is actually where we get our first Asian quote, which is very interesting. Let me find this quote here. Did I pick the wrong page? I think I may have. Well, here we go. So he's talking about, we have a warning both of the production of something better than either. We have a warning example in China, a nation of much talent and, in some respects, even wisdom, owing to a rare good fortune of having been provided at an early period with a particularly good set of customs, the work in some measure of men to whom even the most enlightened European must accord, under certain limitations, the title of sages and philosophers. They are remarkable, too, in the excellence of their apparatus for impressing as far as possible the best wisdom they possess upon every mind in the community, securing that those who have appropriated most shall occupy the posts of honor and power. Surely the people who did this have discovered the secret of human progressiveness, and must have kept themselves steadily at the head of the movement of the world. On the contrary, they have become stationary, and remain for thousands of years. And if they have ever been further improved, it must be by foreigners. This is him, not me, by the way. They have succeeded beyond all hope of what English philanthropists are so industriously working at, making all people all alike, all governing their thoughts and conduct by the same maxims and rules, and these are the fruits. The modern regime of public opinion is, to an unorganized form, what the Chinese educational and political systems are in an organized form, and unless individuality shall be successful to assert itself against its yoke, Europe, notwithstanding its noble antecedents and its professed Christianity, will tend to become another China. And remember, this is imperial China we're talking about, because it's the 19th century. So basically he makes the argument that China is an example of somewhere that had all of these really good customs and at one point really good progress, but it starts to break down. Now, where do we have this? So we had the China example. Is there anything else I want to cover here? Oh yeah, so we talked about, I already read it, so it's on here though, the improvement of customs and progress interaction, how they are always basically fighting for which path is best. And again, his definition of best would be human flourishing / liberty. They're basically the same thing for a million liberal. And then for him, progress basically stops when individuality stops. So this is the kind of utility argument for individuality. So if you want to continue true progress, you actually have to have individuality within the bounds of his theory, that is. And the China example talks about what separates Europe from others. Now this one was interesting. Let me find the quote here. 74 and 75. Oh yeah. So right after that China quote, he has the theory of what made Europe different. Now, this is especially great that we're living in the time when this is a really contentious question, right? So what is Mill's answer? He says this: what has hitherto preserved Europe from this lot? This is on 74, 75 if you have your book. What has made the European family of nations an improving instead of a stationary portion of mankind? Not any superior excellence in them, which, when it exists, exists as the effect, not the cause, but their remarkable diversity of character and culture. So, again, to restate that, it's not any specific excellence in Europe that made them grow in the 19th century, according to Mill. For him, it is actually the diversity of character and culture. And then what does he mean by that? Let's get into it. Individual, classes, nations had and have been extremely unlike one another. They have struck out in a great variety of paths, each leading to something valuable, and although every period those who traveled in different paths have been intolerant of one another, and each would have thought it an excellent thing if all the rest could have been compelled to travel his own road, their attempts to thwart each other's development have rarely had any permanent success, and each has in time endured to receive the good which the others have offered. Europe is, in my judgment, wholly indebted to this plurality of paths for its progressive and many-sided development. Again, to restate that, right? So it's not that Europeans didn't want to force their ideas on everybody else. They couldn't. That's it, right? So they had all these divergent paths in countries and sub-countries, right? And they somehow were forced by history itself to force all these opinions to exist pluralistically together. And again, remember, this is conflict, wars, fighting, but because of this lack of uniformity, you continue to get faster development. That's basically his point. So he mentions the diversity of character and culture, and then he says, each would have liked to compel the other, right? But they couldn't do it. They tried. Unable to. And then he points out, this shows you the danger of over-uniformity and custom of opinion. So it's not like, what's the problem? He says, oh, here we go. So it's decidedly, Europe at his time, right? This is his quote. It is decidedly advancing towards the Chinese ideal of making all people alike. And Mr. de Tocqueville, in his last important work, which was on the United States, actually, remarks how much more the Frenchmen of the present day resemble one another than they did even the last generation. And the same remark may be made for an Englishman is far greater degree. So it's this idea that Europe, starting from the 19th century, started to become way more uniform, but anything that was kind of good of it was because of that forced competition between Europeans. That's where they got a lot of that growth of interesting ideas. I mean, war technology changed every 15 to 20 years for 400 years, right? So some of it's like that, like killing technology, but it's also art and music and the government, right? You're kind of forced to innovate these things. Now, there's another thing he points out. Over time, society tends towards uniformity. This is just his observation of reality. And again, the question is, how do I use my paper, Professor? Well, you're saying, does his analysis from this chapter onward, does it actually apply to our class? It's a great question. And spoiler, it does. You can argue with and against him very well. Now, what does liberal diversity mean? This one's very interesting. Let me find my quote here. Where art thou, my quote? Man, I cannot find this quote to save my life. Let's see. '76. Okay, here we go. So the demand that all other people that shall resemble ourselves grows by what it feeds on. If resistance waits till life is reduced to nearly one uniform type, all deviations from that type will come to be considered impious, immoral, and even monstrous and contrary to nature. Mankind speedily becomes unable to conceive diversity when it has been sometimes unaccustomed to see it. So again, this is imagine pluralistic lifestyles within a framework. That's basically what he means by diversity. All right, so any questions for this slide? If you got them, post them. I'm keeping my eyes open. I'll give it a couple minutes. And I'm going to get something to drink, and you can still hear me, which is wonderful. And if this sounds like a beer, it is not a beer, sadly. It's just sparkling water. It's Lent. I can't have beer. Okay. Otherwise, I would totally do it. All right. And let's see. Any questions popping up? Does not look like it. How are we doing on time? Maybe one more slide, and then we'll do a little vocal discussion. I'll let everybody go. All right. Student. All right. So if there's no questions, assuming there isn't. If there is, I'll totally stop. Okay, let's keep going. So next one. This is Mill Chapter 4. And again, remind you. Okay, so this is interesting. So we're talking about why we need individuals. And, most people here can be like, yeah, great, I'm with you. That's fantastic. But now the question then becomes this chapter, which is, you can't kind of skip this. And we'll start it today. I don't think we're going to finish it, because I'll probably go 10 more minutes, and wherever we stop, we'll pick up on Tuesday. So if you're a little behind on Mill, I'd read it, especially if you think the methodology will help your paper. Okay, now Chapter 4 is on the limits of the authority of society over the individual. So what is, if we're liberal in a million sense, right, what can society do to be basically part of, like, how can it participate in this? That's what we're looking for. Well, this is how he breaks it down. We've already kind of talked about it a little bit, but he's redoing it now. So, society has obligations from and duty to the individual. This is the foundation of Millian thought. Without this, you can't have the rest. You basically must have these two-way obligations for liberty to work. Without these obligations, it's not liberty, it's what we call quote-unquote freedom. And that doesn't work, right? Because if it's just taking, society eventually collapses. So, okay, so here we go. So first, the most important obligation is not injuring the interests of another within legal rights. So, right, so we have this first step. So you can't injure the interests of other people. It's not permitted, because that's not liberty. That is, theft or calumny or libel, right? If you say something bad about another person, destroy their career, that's injuring their interest, right? Especially an untrue thing, right? Truth can't actually be illegal. So if I say something true about you and it destroys your career, well, that's different. And again, like robbing people, harming them, kidnapping them, etc. And then here we go too. So each person bears an equitable share of the labors and sacrifice in defending society and its members. This one is very unpopular for 20th and 21st century, we'll say more liberal thinkers. This is the idea that to be in society, now society literally just means like your group, your nation, your tribe, right? Whatever your affiliation is, your city, you bear an equitable share of the labors and sacrifice in defending that society and its members. So this is taxes, this is a draft, this is everything, right? So this is a big part of kind of the issue you run into. So every person has an equitable share of this labor, and if we don't, then we don't actually have liberty. This is the basic point of all of this. So it's good to pay attention to this, because this is kind of one of the big pillars that this practical liberty is built on. All right. Now, this is not the limit of what society can do to an individual. These would be these first two are the limit of what the society can use force on the individual. So basically, the state can force you to not injure interests of each other within legal rights, and you can kind of be forced to bear an equitable share of the labors and sacrifice for society. Those are the two things you can do. Now, this isn't the limit. What does that mean? Well, in individual acts that are harmful to others but don't break the law, these are punished by opinion. Now, he did spend a bunch of his last chapter talking about the tyranny of opinion, right? It's true. But basically, you can correct with opinion. You don't necessarily have to correct with, let's say, like destroying somebody's job, right? You can just say, like, I don't want to associate with you. Let me find an example here. Let's see. So, So, and when I say punish by opinion, this is like decided by open discussion, right? And it's personal choice, and this includes the right to avoid someone, and then that adult has to get a full share of the consequences. And this is not selfish indifference. He makes a big point here. What he means is people should try to influence other to do good by persuasions, and humans should work to help improve each other. So this doesn't mean if you do something that harms you, and even though you're paying the consequences, I can't try to change your mind, right? This is not leaving people alone to mind their business. So you're still in people's business, but you're using discussion to change their minds, not the force of law, and not ignoring them, right? Because if you imagine we're in the society together, and we do bear kind of responsibility for each other. So if I know you're going the wrong way, and I have access to truth, because let's say I did it through a mill-style discourse, right, and I figured out what the truth was, I do have a duty to you as well in liberty to help you do better. Okay. And then this is a big pillar, and we'll stop here and I'll ask questions, we'll do discussion. We'll finish 4 on Tuesday. But people can choose who they include in their society, and one who has negative traits has no right of respect or endorsement. So these two are very 21st century edgy, which makes them great. So the first part of this, right? You choose who you include in your society. So remember we talked about you have these obligations and duties to society, right? They're right here. Those you can be then excluded from such a society if you choose to not fulfill these duties, right? You can be basically kicked out. If you think 19th century, right? Think that you could be kicked out of a town or a village or a church or any society you're in, you could be excluded from. This is what we'd call the freedom of association, right? And you could argue we don't have it as much as we used to have it. But you have this right of exclusion, which is very important to know, right? And also, the second half of this, one who has negative traits has no right of respect or endorsement. So you're free to do what you want if you're paying the consequences for your actions. Let's say they're harming you, drugs or something, right? Heavy drugs. I don't have to endorse you or respect you. You have no right to my opinion. You only have a right to me, if say somehow you haven't been excluded from my society yet, but you're doing a negative action, you don't actually have the right to get my endorsement or respect. So this is where that line of kind of 19th century utilitarian liberalism is. So it's quite interesting. All right, questions about this, folks? Questions, problems, critiques. You can critique it too if you want. So this is where we'll end the PowerPoint for today. I will jump back onto the Discord and we'll chat for a little bit more before I let y'all go. But any questions here before I move on? Okay, so at least one person's typing. This will be fun. Yeah, and somebody wrote, this sounds like the trend towards uniformity. It does. So think about it like this. You can't have the chapter 4 without 1, 2, 3. So remember, if you don't remember, I'll reread those titles to you, right? So this is the reason his ordering is very deliberate. So, for example, chapter 2 is on liberty of thought and discussion. So first, you do have to have that foundation of thought and discussion first. The next, and before this is, he says, basically political hands-offness. It could be a despotism, but or monarchy, but as long as it hands off the personal and social life, you're fine. And then that chapter 3, right, individuality of one, elements of well-being. So if we have liberty of thought, liberty of discussion, we have individuality as the foundation of our well-being. Then on top of that, we then talk about the limits of authority of society over the individual. So there is constraints here. So it is constraining, right? There is some uniformity. So we'll get to it in the second part. Mill basically makes an argument for, the student who asked this, Mill makes the argument for, you choose your society. So if a society is too uniform for you, you pick another one. That's his answer, basically. All right, any other questions? All right, I'm going to stop the stream for now, folks. Thank you for listening. The next one will be at the same time on Tuesday if you're a student hangout, and I'll answer questions for about 15 minutes in the chat in the Discord. Thank you for listening. Appreciate it.